Chapter 1. The first note of winter. The snow fell in soft whispers, blanketing the small mountain town of Evergreen in a hush that only winter could compose. Each flake danced in the moonlight like tiny ballerinas, spiraling downward to cover the rooftops, the cobblestone streets, and the sprawling pines that lined the town square. The air was heavy with the scent of pine needles and distant chimney smoke, as if the season itself had wrapped its arms around the town in an embrace of frost and silence. Carol Winters stood at the edge of the town square, her scarf pulled tightly around her neck as she gazed at the towering spruce tree in the center. The tree was adorned with strings of golden lights and delicate ornaments, each one swaying gently in the crisp night breeze. Beneath its boughs, children had built a fortress of snow, their laughter still echoing faintly in the stillness, now only a memory carried by the night. In her hands, Carol held a music box, a small, ornate thing that had once belonged to her mother. Its golden casing shimmered faintly under the street lamps, and the intricate carvings of holly leaves and bells along its edges seemed almost alive in the faint glow. She turned the tiny key, the mechanism clicking faintly as it began to play a hauntingly beautiful tune. The melody was soft, almost fragile, like the snowflakes landing on her coat sleeve, and it carried with it the weight of countless winters past. Carol closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. This was the song her mother used to hum as she tucked her in on cold December nights, a song of hope, of warmth, and of something just out of reach. It had been years since Carol had dared to open the box, the memories it carried too painful to confront. But tonight, something had drawn her to it, like a thread of invisible snow binding her to the past. Across the square, the faint sound of bells chimed from the steeple of the old church. Midnight. The town was asleep, its windows dark save for the flickering of a few candles in windowsills, placed there by tradition to guide lost travelers. The world seemed paused, holding its breath in anticipation of something unseen. Carol began to walk, the music box tucked under her arm as her boots crunched against the snow-covered path. She had no particular destination in mind, only the sense that she needed to move, to follow the melody where it led her. The streets of Evergreen were familiar, yet tonight they felt different, cloaked in a kind of magic that only came with the first snowfall of the season. Her path took her past the old bakery, its windows frosted over, but still adorned with wreaths of holly and red ribbons. The scent of cinnamon lingered faintly in the air, a ghost of the day's baking. Beyond it lay the toy shop, its display filled with hand-carved figurines and mechanical wonders that twirled and danced on hidden gears. The shopkeeper had once been a friend of her family, but time and distance had made them strangers. As she walked, the music seemed to grow louder, though she knew it was impossible. It was as if the town itself was humming along, its snow-draped streets and silent rooftops joining in a chorus only she could hear. She paused at the edge of the lake, its surface frozen into a mirror that reflected the stars above. Here, the melody seemed to reach its crescendo, a swell of notes that sent a shiver down her spine. In the distance, she saw the faint outline of a figure, a man standing at the far edge of the lake. He was still, his silhouette barely distinguishable from the shadows of the trees behind him. Carol hesitated, the music box suddenly feeling heavy in her hands. The figure didn't move, and yet she felt a pull, a strange sense of familiarity that she couldn't place. The music faltered, the last note trailing off into silence as the key unwound. The moment broke, and Carol realized she was standing alone once more, the figure gone as if it had never been there. The air around her felt colder now, the snow sharper against her skin. Clutching the music box tightly, she turned back toward home, her heart pounding with an unshakable sense that this was only the beginning. The first note of winter had been played, and its melody lingered in the air, waiting for its next verse. Chapter 2. whispers beneath the icicles. The dawn came slowly to Evergreen, its pale light filtering through a sky thick with heavy gray clouds. Snow had continued to fall through the night, blanketing the world in an untouched expanse of white. The branches of the tall spruce trees groaned under the weight of their icy burdens, their tips glittering with frozen crystals that caught the early morning sun. Carol sat by her window, a cup of steaming tea cradled between her hands as she watched the world stir awake. Her small cottage, nestled at the edge of the woods, felt like a sanctuary in the quiet of winter. The air inside was warm, the faint scent of pine wood from the crackling fire mingling with the aroma of her tea. On the sill beside her, the music box lay closed, its golden surface reflecting the shifting light of the flames. The events of the previous night lingered in her mind. She had barely slept, haunted not by fear, but by a strange sense of unease. The figure by the lake, the way the music had seemed to guide her, none of it made sense. It felt as though she had stepped into a dream, one that refused to let go even as morning broke. She took a sip of her tea and let her gaze drift toward the woods. The trees stood tall and resolute, their trunks wrapped in frost like sentinels guarding secrets buried deep within. Carol had always found comfort in the forest, its quietness a balm for her restless thoughts. But today, even the woods seemed different, as if they too were holding their breath, waiting. The sound of a distant bell pulled her attention back to the town. It was the same chime she had heard the night before, faint and rhythmic, as though calling her back. Setting her cup aside, Carol rose and wrapped herself in her thick wool coat. The music box found its way into her pocket, its weight reassuring as she stepped out into the cold. The path to town was treacherous, the fresh snow hiding patches of ice beneath. Carol's boots crunched against the frozen ground, each step accompanied by the soft hiss of snow falling from the branches above. The forest was alive with quiet sounds. The rustle of a bird's wings, the creak of a tree bending in the wind, the faint whisper of snowflakes settling into place. As she reached the outskirts of Evergreen, she noticed the town square was already bustling with activity. Vendors were setting up their stalls for the annual Christmas market, their tables piled high with handmade wreaths, jars of spiced preserves, and ornaments carved from wood and painted in vibrant colors. Children darted between the stalls, their laughter filling the air as they tossed snowballs and admired the glittering wares. Carol made her way to the edge of the square, drawn again to the towering spruce tree that stood at its center. Its golden lights shimmered in the daylight, casting soft reflections on the snow below. She reached into her pocket and ran her fingers over the smooth surface of the music box, her thoughts wandering back to her mother. The tree had always been a focal point of her childhood Christmases. She remembered standing here with her parents, the three of them singing carols as the town gathered to light the tree. Her mother's voice had been soft but steady, carrying the melodies with a warmth that wrapped around her like a blanket. Now, standing beneath the tree's branches, Carol felt the echoes of those songs in her heart, a faint rhythm pulsing beneath the noise of the market. Her attention was drawn to a nearby stall, where an elderly man was arranging a collection of hand-carved ornaments. Among them was a small, delicate angel, its wings etched with intricate patterns that shimmered faintly in the light. Something about it reminded her of the ornaments her mother used to hang on their tree, each one carefully chosen for its symbolism. As she reached for the angel, her hand brushed against something cold and smooth. She looked down to see a small, folded piece of paper nestled among the ornaments. Its edges were slightly yellowed, as though it had been tucked away for years. Curiosity prickled at her, and she picked it up, unfolding it slowly. The note was handwritten, the ink faint but legible. To the one who hears the song, follow the path where the snow never melts. There, you will find what you seek. Carol's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. The words felt as though they had been written for her, though she couldn't begin to understand their meaning. She turned to the vendor, but the man was gone, his stall suddenly empty as though it had never been there. The market seemed to blur around her, the sounds of laughter and music fading into the background. Clutching the note tightly, Carol stepped back from the tree and turned toward the woods. The snow beneath her feet felt different now, softer, almost as if guiding her. The forest loomed ahead, its icy branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. She hesitated at the edge, the words of the note echoing in her mind. Follow the path where the snow never melts. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, her boots sinking into the untouched snow as the trees closed in around her. The air grew colder, sharper, and the faint melody of the music box seemed to hum faintly in her pocket, as if urging her onward. The whispers of the icicles above seemed to follow her, their faint, crystalline song mingling with the growing sense of anticipation in her chest. Whatever lay ahead, Carol knew she couldn't turn back now. The forest held answers, and she was determined to find them. Chapter 3: The Path of Frozen Echoes. The forest was an unfamiliar maze of shadows and frost, its depths cloaked in a quiet that felt both tranquil and unnerving. Carol's boots pressed into the fresh snow, the soft crunch the only sound accompanying her as she ventured deeper. The sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above, casting faint patterns of light and shadow that danced with every slight movement of the trees. The note in her hand was crumpled now, the edges softening from her grip. She had read it over and over, each word searing itself into her thoughts. The path where the snow never melts. It was an enigma, a riddle whispered by the forest itself. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had stepped into a place outside of time, a threshold where the ordinary rules of the world no longer applied. Carol paused at the base of a towering spruce, her breath visible in the frigid air. She glanced around, her gaze searching for something, anything that could guide her. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, its trees like sentinels guarding a secret they refused to share. But then, there it was, a faint glimmer of light, no brighter than a dying ember, flickering somewhere far ahead. It wasn't sunlight, of that she was certain. The glow was colder, almost spectral, and yet it beckoned her with an unspoken promise. She pressed forward, the snow growing denser and crunching more sharply underfoot. The melody of the music box seemed to hum faintly again in her pocket, its presence a reassuring weight as she moved toward the light. The path began to narrow, the trees crowding closer together as if conspiring to keep her out. Their branches arched overhead, forming a tunnel laced with icicles that sparkled faintly. The snow here was different, untouched and strangely pristine, as though no living thing had ever disturbed it. As she walked, a peculiar sensation settled over her, a feeling that she was being watched. She stopped and turned slowly, scanning her surroundings. The forest appeared empty, its stillness absolute. But the shadows seemed deeper now, their shapes shifting subtly as if alive. Carol shook off the unease and continued. The glow ahead grew stronger, resolving into something more distinct. It emanated from a clearing, its edges defined by a circle of tall, frost-covered pines. The air grew colder as she approached, each breath sharper than the last. The clearing was like a sanctuary carved from winter itself. At its center stood a fountain, its base intricately carved with scenes of snow-covered landscapes and celestial patterns. Ice cascaded down its sides, frozen mid-flow, creating delicate crystalline formations. Carol stepped closer, drawn to the fountain's strange beauty. As she neared, she noticed something unusual. The snow around the fountain was untouched, flawless in its purity. No footprints marred its surface, not even those of animals. It was as if the clearing existed in a world apart, suspended in a moment that never changed. She crouched beside the fountain, her gloved hand brushing the icy surface. The cold bit at her fingertips, sharper than she had expected, and for a moment, she thought she heard something. A faint hum, almost imperceptible, emanating from within the frozen water. Her heart quickened as she reached into her pocket and retrieved the music box. The golden surface seemed to shimmer faintly, catching the glow of the clearing's light. With a sense of purpose, she wound the key and opened it. The melody that spilled out was hauntingly familiar, the same song that had guided her the night before. But here, in this space, it sounded different, fuller, richer, as though the clearing itself was amplifying the notes. The fountain's hum grew stronger, harmonizing with the music box in a way that sent shivers down her spine. Carol leaned in, her breath fogging the air as she studied the fountain more closely. Carved into the ice near its base was a single word, etched with precision: Aurora. The name resonated within her, stirring something deep and intangible. She whispered it under her breath, testing its weight, its meaning. Aurora, the dawn, the light that chases away the dark. It felt significant, though she couldn't yet understand why. As she rose, a gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it a flurry of snowflakes that danced in the air. The glow from the clearing dimmed momentarily, and when it returned, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A narrow path leading away from the fountain, its edges marked by small, flickering lights embedded in the snow. The lights pulsed softly, like tiny stars guiding her toward an unknown destination. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping onto the path. The air grew colder still, but the music box's melody provided a strange sense of warmth, urging her forward. The path twisted and turned, weaving through the trees in an almost labyrinthine fashion. The lights ahead seemed to flicker in rhythm with her steps, their glow growing brighter as she pressed on. The forest grew quieter with each passing moment, the sounds of the world falling away until only the hum of the music box and her own heartbeat remained. Finally, the path opened into another clearing, this one smaller and more intimate. At its center stood a simple wooden bench, its surface dusted with a thin layer of snow. Beside it, nestled in the snow, was a lantern glowing with the same ethereal light that had guided her here. Carol approached cautiously, her breath catching as she noticed another folded note resting on the bench. The paper was the same as before, its edges weathered by time. She picked it up with trembling hands and unfolded it. The message was brief, yet its meaning was profound. In the heart of winter lies the promise of spring. Trust the light to lead you home. A sudden warmth spread through her chest, a feeling of hope blooming amidst the cold. She looked around, the forest seeming less imposing now, its shadows less menacing. The path ahead was unclear, but the promise of the note filled her with resolve. Carol tucked the note into her pocket, her gaze fixed on the lantern's light. She didn't know where this journey would lead, but for the first time in years, she felt ready to follow it, wherever it might take her. Chapter 4: Snowflakes and Secrets. The lantern's glow was soft and steady, its light cutting through the deep shadows of the forest. Carol stood before it, the folded note tucked into her pocket, her breath fogging the air in steady, rhythmic puffs. The words of the message played over and over in her mind. In the heart of winter lies the promise of spring. Trust the light to lead you home. Home. The word felt distant and unfamiliar, as though it referred to a place she had once known but couldn't quite remember. Was it her small cottage on the edge of Evergreen? Or was it something more abstract, something intangible, waiting for her at the end of this strange, winding journey? The music box in her pocket felt heavier now, its melody still lingering in the air, faint but persistent, as if it were coming not from the box itself, but from the forest around her. Carol took a deep breath and turned her gaze toward the path ahead. The lights embedded in the snow flickered softly, forming a trail that curved deeper into the woods. She followed the lights, her boots crunching against the pristine snow. The path was narrower here, flanked by tall pines whose branches hung low under the weight of ice. The wind whistled through the trees, carrying with it a faint, ethereal sound that made Carol stop in her tracks. It wasn't just the wind. It was a melody, haunting and delicate, weaving its way through the forest like a whispered secret. Her heart quickened. The melody was achingly familiar, a song she hadn't heard in years but couldn't place. It wasn't the tune of the music box, though it bore a striking similarity. This melody was fuller, richer, as though it were being played on an unseen instrument somewhere far ahead. Drawn by the sound, Carol quickened her pace. The wind grew stronger, swirling snowflakes around her in a dizzying dance. The lights along the path flickered more brightly now, their glow almost urgent, as if urging her onward. The trail curved sharply, and when Carol rounded the bend, she found herself standing at the edge of another clearing. This one was larger than the last, its center dominated by an old stone gazebo. The structure was covered in frost, its columns shimmering like glass in the pale light. Ivy, frozen in mid-climb, wrapped itself around the stone, its leaves delicate and translucent. At the center of the gazebo stood an object that caught her breath, a grand, weathered harp, its strings shimmering like spun silver. The instrument seemed impossibly intact despite the elements, as though it had been protected by some unseen force. The melody that had guided her here swirled around the harp, emanating from it like a living thing. Carol stepped closer, her boots sinking into the snow. The air around the gazebo was warmer, the cold fading as she crossed the threshold of its stone steps. The harp strings vibrated faintly, their sound resonating through her chest. She reached out, her gloved hand hovering just above the strings, the warmth of the instrument radiating toward her fingertips. Before she could touch it, the wind shifted again, carrying with it another sound, a soft, distant hum, like a voice singing in harmony with the harp's melody. Carol froze, her eyes scanning the forest beyond the clearing. The voice was faint, barely audible, but it was there, intertwining with the harp's song in a way that felt intentional. A sudden gust of wind swept through the gazebo, stirring the snow at her feet and causing the harp's strings to vibrate more forcefully. The melody grew louder, more insistent, and Carol felt a pull, as though the music itself were guiding her toward something just beyond her reach. She turned back toward the forest, her heart pounding. The voice was still there, calling her forward, its tone filled with both urgency and reassurance. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping back down the gazebo's stairs, the snow crunching beneath her boots as she re-entered the woods. The path ahead was marked not by lights this time, but by the sound of the voice and the harp's melody, their combined song weaving through the trees like a thread leading her onward. The forest grew darker, the shadows deeper, but the music kept her grounded, its rhythm steady and unwavering. As she walked, the trees began to thin, their trunks giving way to a wide, open expanse of snow-covered ground. At the far end of the clearing stood a figure, silhouetted against the faint glow of the horizon. The figure was motionless, its outline sharp and distinct in the pale light. Carol's breath caught in her throat. The figure was the same as the one she had seen by the lake the night before, the same sense of familiarity and mystery surrounding it. She took a cautious step forward, her boots sinking deeper into the snow. The figure didn't move, but the music shifted, the harp's melody softening as the voice grew stronger. Carol could now make out words within the song, though their meaning was unclear. The language was unfamiliar, yet it resonated within her as though she had always known it. When she was only a few steps away, the figure turned. It was a man, his features obscured by the shadows, but his presence was unmistakable. He radiated warmth, a quiet strength that seemed to calm the storm of questions swirling in her mind. The man raised a hand, and the melody ceased. The silence that followed was profound, heavy with unspoken meaning. Carol's heart raced as she stood before him, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The man stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small object, a folded piece of paper, weathered and worn, just like the notes she had found. Without a word, he extended it toward her. Carol hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest moment. The paper was cold, its edges rough beneath her touch. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the words written there. "The song will lead you home, but first, you must remember the melody." She looked up, but the man was gone, his presence fading into the shadows as though he had never been there. The clearing was silent now, the wind stilled, the music a faint echo in the back of her mind. Clutching the note tightly, Carol turned back toward the forest, the path ahead shrouded in mystery but illuminated by the light of her own resolve. Whatever lay ahead, she knew she couldn't stop now. The melody, the man, the notes, they were all part of a story she was only beginning to understand. And as she stepped back into the woods, the snow beneath her feet whispered promises of what was still to come. Chapter 5. The Footprints She Left Behind. The forest was quieter now, as though it held its breath, waiting for something unseen to unfold. Carol clutched the note tightly in her hand. Its words burned into her memory. "The song will lead you home, but first, you must remember the melody." The paper was worn and fragile, as if it had traveled through countless winters to reach her. Each step she took forward felt deliberate, her boots crunching against the snow with a steady rhythm. The harp's melody no longer echoed in her ears, but its absence only heightened the quiet hum of the forest around her. The pines stood tall and stoic, their frosted branches forming an intricate web of shadows above her. She followed the faint trail left by the figure, though no footprints marked the snow. Carol's thoughts drifted back to the man in the clearing. His presence lingered like an afterimage, vivid yet ephemeral, his features obscured but unforgettable. Who was he? And why did he feel so achingly familiar? There was a pull in her chest, an instinctive certainty that he was part of this strange, winding journey, perhaps even the key to understanding it. The trail curved sharply, leading her to a shallow ravine. The frozen stream below glinted faintly in the moonlight, its surface like shattered glass. A narrow wooden bridge spanned the gap, its planks weathered and uneven, the handrails wrapped in frost. Carol paused at the edge, the weight of the note in her hand grounding her as she surveyed the scene. The air shifted, carrying with it a faint hum, so soft she almost missed it. It wasn't the harp or the ethereal voice. This was different, subtler, like the vibration of a distant string. The sound resonated within her chest, awakening a long-buried memory she couldn't quite grasp. She stepped onto the bridge, the wood creaking beneath her weight. The hum grew stronger, rippling through the stillness as though it were guiding her forward. Midway across, she stopped, her eyes drawn to the stream below. Beneath the ice, faint streaks of light danced like trapped fireflies, their glow pulsing in time with the hum. The sight was mesmerizing, a reminder that even beneath the weight of winter, life still stirred. Carol's gaze lingered on the lights for a moment longer before she continued across the bridge. The path on the other side was different, narrower and lined with slender birch trees whose silver bark gleamed in the dim light. The trail twisted sharply, leading her deeper into the forest until she emerged into another clearing. This one was smaller, more intimate. The the ground blanketed in untouched snow that sparkled like a field of diamonds. At its center stood a stone well, its surface overgrown with frost-covered ivy. The hum was stronger here, vibrating through the air like an invisible thread connecting her to the well. She approached cautiously, her breath fogging the air as she leaned over the edge. The well was deeper than it appeared, its darkness impenetrable save for faint pinpricks of light far below, like stars scattered in a night sky. The hum seemed to emanate from the depths, its rhythm steady and hypnotic. Carol reached into her pocket and retrieved the music box. It was warm to the touch, its surface glowing faintly as though responding to the energy around it. She wound the key slowly, the familiar melody spilling into the air and blending seamlessly with the hum. The sound resonated through the clearing, stirring the snow at her feet like ripples in a pond. As the last note of the melody faded, the well responded. A soft glow rose from its depths, illuminating the ivy-covered stones and casting long shadows across the clearing. The light grew brighter, revealing a set of carved symbols around the edge of the well. Carol knelt to examine them, her fingers brushing against the frost as she traced the intricate patterns. The symbols were unfamiliar, but their meaning felt instinctively clear. They were notes, musical in nature, forming a melody that was both ancient and timeless. The hum deepened, and the lights in the well began to shift, forming shapes and patterns that danced in time with the unseen music. Carol felt her heart quicken as she realized what was happening. The melody she needed to remember was here, encoded in the carvings and the lights, waiting for her to unlock it. She closed her eyes, letting the hum guide her. The music box in her hand vibrated faintly, its warmth spreading through her palm as though urging her onward. She could almost hear the melody now, its notes intertwining with the hum to form a song that resonated deep within her. Images began to surface in her mind, fragments of memories that didn't feel entirely her own. A small room bathed in golden light, the sound of laughter mingling with the soft notes of a piano, a hand reaching out to hers, warm and steady. The fragments were fleeting, slipping away before she could grasp them, but they left behind a feeling of profound longing. When she opened her eyes, the clearing seemed different, brighter, and more alive. The snow sparkled with a faint inner light, and the birch trees swayed gently in a wind she couldn't feel. The well's glow had faded, leaving only the carvings as a silent reminder of the melody she was meant to uncover. Carol stood, the music box still warm in her hand, and turned back toward the forest. The path ahead was shrouded in shadows, but the hum remained, steady and unwavering. She knew she couldn't stop now, not when she was so close to understanding the truth. As she stepped back onto the trail, the wind stirred, carrying with it a faint whisper. The words were indistinct, but their meaning was clear. The melody will guide you, but the song is yours to sing. With renewed determination, Carol continued forward, the promise of the melody pulling her deeper into the heart of the forest and closer to the answers she sought. Chapter 6: Harmony of Frosted Hearts. The forest thinned into a frozen meadow, its expanse like a quiet breath between the towering trees. Carol paused at the edge, the weight of her journey settling in her chest. Snow blanketed the field in undisturbed drifts, glittering faintly under the pale light of the crescent moon. The hum that had guided her steps grew fainter here, as though it, too, hesitated to cross the meadow. In the center stood an old oak, its gnarled branches stretching skyward like frozen veins. Unlike the other trees she had passed, this one held onto its leaves, withered and silvered with frost. They rustled faintly in the still air. Beneath the oak was a bench, carved from the same ancient wood and worn smooth by time. Carol approached it cautiously, her steps muffled by the soft snow. As she drew nearer, she noticed an object resting on the bench. It was a book, its cover bound in cracked leather and dusted with frost. A silver clasp held it shut, engraved with a small, intricate snowflake. Carol reached out, hesitating for a moment before running her fingers over the clasp. It was cold to the touch but warmed under her hand, as though recognizing her. The clasp released with a faint click, and the book fell open to its center. The pages were blank at first glance, but as Carol tilted them toward the moonlight, faint words began to appear, shimmering like frost patterns on glass. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the air as she read. To remember is to see. To see is to know. Follow the whispers, and the melody will reveal its truth. The words lingered briefly before fading back into the blankness of the page. Carol's chest tightened as she turned the pages, searching for more, but the rest of the book remained empty. She closed it gently and set it aside, her gaze lifting to the oak's branches. From somewhere within the meadow came a faint sound, so quiet it was almost imperceptible. It was not the hum she had followed, but something softer, a whisper carried on the wind. The sound seemed to emanate from all directions, weaving through the trees and curling around her like a thread pulling her forward. Carol rose and stepped past the oak, her boots sinking into the snow as she followed the whisper. The meadow seemed larger now, its boundaries stretching into the dark. The whisper grew clearer with each step, forming fragments of words that danced just out of reach. It wasn't a voice she recognized, but it stirred something deep within her, a sense of familiarity that made her heart ache. The snow deepened as she walked, slowing her pace. The meadow sloped gently upward, and at its crest, she found herself standing before a circle of standing stones. Each was weathered and ancient, their surfaces etched with runes that pulsed faintly with a silvery light. In the center of the circle was a raised stone altar, its surface covered in frost and engraved with the same intricate patterns as the runes. The whisper swirled around her now, filling the air with a faint melody that seemed to echo from the stones themselves. Carol stepped into the circle, her breath catching as the runes' glow intensified. The air within the circle felt different, heavier, as though it held the weight of countless untold stories. She approached the altar, her gaze drawn to the runes etched into its surface. They were arranged in a spiral, and as she traced them with her fingers, the melody grew louder, its notes resonating in her chest. The runes seemed to hum beneath her touch, vibrating with an energy that felt both ancient and alive. The music box in her pocket grew warm, and Carol pulled it out, its glow brightening as she wound the key. When the first note played, the runes on the altar shifted, their light rippling outward like water. The melody of the box intertwined with the whisper, and for a moment, the air was filled with a harmony so beautiful it brought tears to her eyes. The light from the runes coalesced, forming a shimmering image above the altar. It was faint, like the reflection of a dream, but Carol could make out the shape of a figure. They stood with their back to her, their features blurred, but their presence was undeniable. The figure turned slowly, their gaze meeting hers, and though their face was obscured, their eyes shone with a light that pierced through her like an arrow. The figure raised a hand, pointing to the edge of the meadow. As the gesture broke the harmony, the light faded, and the figure dissolved into the night. The whisper softened, retreating into the stones, but its melody lingered, faint and mournful. Carol turned in the direction the figure had pointed, her heart pounding as she stepped out of the circle. The meadow stretched out before her, and in the distance, she could see a faint glow, like the light of a distant fire. It was small but steady, a beacon in the darkness that called to her. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and something sweeter, like the memory of a distant spring. Carol tightened her grip on the music box and began walking toward the light, her steps steady and purposeful. The hum and the whisper had faded, but their promise remained, guiding her forward. As she left the meadow behind, the circle of stones stood silent and still, their light dimming until they were no more than shadows against the snow. Chapter 7. Beneath the Twilight Skies. The faint glow in the distance grew steadier with each step Carol took, its golden light flickering softly against the deep blues and grays of the snowy expanse. Her breath, visible in the frosty air, came in rhythmic puffs as she trudged forward, the snow crunching underfoot. Though the whisper and hum had faded, the presence of something unseen, guiding and benevolent, lingered around her like a protective veil. As she crested a small hill, the source of the glow revealed itself. A quaint cottage nestled in a clearing, its thatched roof laden with snow. Light spilled from its frosted windows, illuminating the icy path that led to its door. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, merging with the winter sky in a dance that seemed almost alive. Despite its isolation, the cottage exuded warmth, as if inviting weary travelers to rest within its walls. Carol hesitated at the edge of the clearing, a flicker of uncertainty rising in her chest. The cottage felt out of place, its vibrant glow a stark contrast to the stillness of the forest. Yet it didn't feel threatening. If anything, it seemed to belong to a world outside of time, untouched by the harshness of the surrounding wilderness. Gathering her resolve, she moved toward the door, her footsteps crunching in the otherwise silent night. As she approached, she noticed intricate carvings on the doorframe, patterns of vines and stars intertwined with symbols she didn't recognize. They shimmered faintly in the light, as though responding to her presence. The door opened before she could knock, swinging inward with a creak that echoed softly into the night. Warmth poured out, enveloping her like a familiar embrace. She stepped inside, her boots sinking slightly into a woven rug that covered the wooden floor. The interior of the cottage was small but cozy, with a single room dominated by a large stone hearth. Flames crackled within it, their light casting flickering shadows across the walls. A table stood near the window, set with a simple arrangement of bread, cheese, and a pitcher of water. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, jars of herbs, and small trinkets that seemed to tell stories of their own. In the center of the room stood a chair, carved from dark wood and draped with a quilt that looked as though it had been stitched together over many winters. On the chair sat a music box, not unlike Carol's own. Its lacquered surface gleamed in the firelight, and its key, shaped like a delicate snowflake, lay beside it. Carol's gaze lingered on the music box, a wave of déjà vu washing over her. It was as though the cottage had been expecting her, its every detail tailored to her arrival. She approached the hearth, drawn to its warmth, and sank into the chair. The quilt felt soft and heavy against her shoulders, and for the first time in what felt like days, her body relaxed. The music box on the table seemed to hum faintly, its sound almost imperceptible against the crackling fire. Carol reached out and picked it up, turning it over in her hands. The craftsmanship was exquisite, its surface engraved with swirling patterns that mirrored the carvings on the doorframe. When she wound the key, the melody that emerged was hauntingly familiar. It intertwined with the memory of the whispers she had followed, and for a moment, she felt as though she were listening to a fragment of her own soul. The fire flared briefly, casting a brighter light across the room, and when it settled, the air seemed charged with energy. Carol looked toward the shelves, where the jars and trinkets now glowed faintly, their colors shifting like the northern lights. One jar, in particular, caught her attention. It was filled with a silvery substance that sparkled like frost on glass, and it seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. She approached the shelf and lifted the jar carefully. Its surface was cold against her fingers, and as she peered into its depths, she saw shapes forming within. Fleeting images of forests, meadows, and faces she didn't recognize but felt she should. The jar grew warmer in her hands, and for a moment, the room seemed to fade around her. She was standing in the meadow again, the oak tree looming above her. The runes on the stones glowed brightly, their patterns shifting in time with the music. The whisper returned, faint but insistent, and it carried a single word: remember. The vision dissolved as quickly as it had come, and Carol found herself back in the cottage, the jar still warm in her hands. She placed it back on the shelf, her mind racing with questions she couldn't yet answer. The fire crackled again, drawing her attention to the hearth. Above it hung a simple mirror, its frame made of the same dark wood as the chair. In its reflection, Carol saw the room as it was, but there was something more. An outline of a figure standing behind her, faint and translucent. She turned quickly, but the room was empty. The sense of being watched lingered, though it wasn't unsettling. If anything, it felt as though the presence was protective, guiding her towards something she was meant to find. Carol returned to the chair, her gaze falling once again on the music box. She wounded again, letting the melody fill the room, and as she listened, the carvings on the doorframe seemed to shimmer once more. The cottage was more than it seemed. A keeper of stories, a hearth for travelers lost in the snow. And as Carol drifted into a light, dreamless sleep, she felt a sense of belonging she hadn't known in years, as though she had taken the first step toward a truth hidden within the frost-bound world. Chapter 8. The Song Only Snow Hears. The morning brought a pale, watery sunlight that seeped through the frosted window panes of the cottage, casting elongated beams across the floor. Carol stirred in the chair, the heavy quilt draped around her shoulders like a shield against the cold world outside. The faint hum of the music box had ceased during the night, its lid now closed as if resting after a long recital. The room was quiet, save for the soft crackling of the embers that still glowed in the hearth. The warmth embraced her, a sharp contrast to the biting chill she knew awaited beyond the door. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if she could remain here indefinitely, enveloped by the serene comfort of the cottage. But then her eyes were drawn to the mirror above the hearth. Its glass had misted over, as though breathed upon by an unseen force. Shapes swirled faintly within the haze, hints of motion and shadows that didn't belong to the room. Carol rose slowly, the quilt slipping from her shoulders, and stepped closer to the mirror. The glass seemed to ripple as she approached, and the fog within it began to clear. What emerged wasn't a reflection of the room but a vision of a frozen lake, its surface glittering under a pale sun. Trees lined its edges, their bare branches arching toward the sky like skeletal hands. Carol's breath caught as the lake shifted in the glass, the image moving as though alive. She reached out, her fingertips grazing the cool surface of the mirror. The moment her skin made contact, the vision dissolved, replaced by her own reflection. But something was different. In the mirror, her face looked more serene, her eyes brighter, as though the weight she had carried for so long had been lifted in some imperceptible way. When she turned back to the room, the air felt different, charged with a faint electricity. The trinkets on the shelves glimmered faintly, and the fire in the hearth flared as though stirred by an unseen wind. Carol felt compelled to move, as though something beyond her understanding was guiding her steps. She stepped out of the cottage, the crisp morning air biting at her cheeks. The snow underfoot was pristine, untouched by any footprints save her own. The forest loomed around her, silent and still, but she felt no fear. There was a pull within her chest, a gentle yet insistent force that drew her toward the trees. The path she followed was not one she had seen before. It twisted through the forest, winding between ancient oaks and pines that seemed to whisper faintly as she passed. The snow grew thinner beneath her boots, patches of frost glistening on the exposed ground. The air was colder here, sharper, and with each step, she felt as though she were descending deeper into an unknown world. At last, she emerged into a clearing. Before her lay the frozen lake she had seen in the mirror, its surface a sheet of glass reflecting the pale sky above. The ice was marbled with delicate veins of silver, and at its center, a single figure stood. The figure was indistinct, shrouded in a faint mist that swirled around it like a living thing. Carol felt no fear as she stepped closer, the crunch of snow beneath her boots the only sound in the stillness. The figure didn't move, yet its presence was magnetic, pulling her toward the lake's edge. As she neared, the ice beneath her feet hummed faintly, a resonance that seemed to echo deep within her bones. She knelt at the edge of the lake, her breath fogging the surface, and placed her hand against the ice. The hum grew louder, and within the ice, shapes began to form. Faces, blurred and fleeting, emerged and dissolved like reflections on water. They were familiar yet unplaceable, as though plucked from memories she had forgotten. Among them, she saw herself, her own face younger, unlined by grief, smiling in a way she no longer remembered. The figure at the center of the lake began to move, gliding across the ice with an otherworldly grace. As it approached, the mist surrounding it dissipated, revealing a form that was both human and not. Its features were obscured, its outline shifting as though made of smoke and light, but its presence was undeniable. The figure stopped a few feet from Carol, and though it had no discernible face, she felt its gaze upon her. The hum of the ice became a melody, faint and haunting, and she realized it was the same tune the music box had played. The figure raised an arm, pointing toward the far edge of the lake. Carol followed its gesture, her eyes falling on a stone archway partially hidden by the trees. It was ancient, its surface covered in frost and lichen, and it pulsed faintly with the same light she had seen in the cottage. When she turned back to the figure, it was gone, leaving only the faintest wisp of mist in its place. The lake was still, its surface unmarred by any trace of movement. Carol rose, her gaze fixed on the archway. The pull in her chest grew stronger, urging her forward. She stepped onto the ice, the cold biting through the soles of her boots, and began to walk. The melody lingered in the air around her, a guiding thread that wove through the stillness. When she reached the archway, she saw that it wasn't simply an exit from the lake, but a gateway to something beyond. The air shimmered within its frame, bending light in a way that suggested a different world lay on the other side. Carol hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what lay beyond the archway, but she knew she couldn't turn back. The pull within her was too strong, the promise of answers too alluring. With a deep breath, she stepped through, leaving the frozen lake and its silent keeper behind. The world around her shifted, the air growing warmer and filled with a golden light. She had crossed a threshold, not just into a new place but into a new chapter of her journey, one that held both the answers she sought and mysteries she couldn't yet fathom. Chapter 9. In the Echo of Silent Bells. The golden light that had embraced Carol beyond the archway felt almost tangible, wrapping itself around her like a comforting cloak. It was warmth in its purest form, a balm against the cold that still lingered at the edges of her consciousness. As she walked further into this strange new world, the weight of the forest, the snow, and the cottage seemed to dissolve, as if she had left them behind entirely. But the questions lingered, always just at the edges of her thoughts. Where am I? What is this place? She was no longer standing on the ice, nor on the frozen ground. Beneath her feet, the earth felt solid but strange, soft and uneven, like walking on a path of velvet and moss. The trees here were different too. Their trunks were thick, their leaves iridescent, casting a shimmering glow that bathed the entire space in a soft, ethereal light. The branches seemed to hum faintly, a sound almost too quiet to notice, but somehow it filled the air, reverberating deep within her chest. The world before her was bathed in a perpetual twilight, neither day nor night, but a balance somewhere in between, as though time itself had ceased to matter. There was an odd stillness to the air, one that felt peaceful yet heavy with meaning. And in that stillness, Carol heard something. A whisper that was not of words but of thoughts, as though the very ground beneath her was speaking to her in a language she had forgotten. Her heart quickened as the whispers grew louder, though the source remained hidden, as elusive as the wind. The path she walked stretched out before her, winding deeper into the forest, but something about it felt familiar, as if she had walked this very path before, even though she knew she had not. As she ventured on, the trees began to thin, their roots spreading like ancient veins across the earth, and the air grew even warmer. She passed by pools of water, their surfaces shimmering like liquid mirrors, each reflecting not only the landscape but visions, vivid, colorful images that flickered in the depths, stories untold, faces long forgotten. Carol stopped in front of one such pool, mesmerized by the images that played across its surface. She leaned closer, staring intently at the rippling water. There was something in the reflections, a figure, blurred at first, then clearer as the ripples settled. It was her face, but younger, less burdened. She looked happy, standing in a place she couldn't place, surrounded by a warmth that seemed to pulse from her very being. Carol's breath caught. The image faded as quickly as it had appeared, and in its place, the reflection of another figure emerged. A man, tall and strong, with dark hair and eyes that gleamed like the depths of the forest. His expression was filled with something: recognition, longing, or perhaps something else entirely. Carol's pulse quickened. Who was this man? Was he a memory of someone she had known, or was he someone she had yet to meet? Before she could contemplate further, a shift in the air caught her attention. It wasn't a sound so much as a presence. Something had entered the space with her. Carol turned quickly, her eyes searching the shifting shadows of the trees. In the dim twilight, shapes moved, but they weren't animals. They were figures, cloaked in the same shimmering glow as the trees, their faces obscured, their forms shifting like mist. They approached slowly, their steps silent, and Carol felt an odd tug in her chest, a sense that they were not threatening but beckoning. Her feet moved almost of their own accord, stepping lightly through the moss-covered ground as she followed them down the winding path. The figures did not speak, but they seemed to guide her, moving with the natural grace of beings who belonged to this place. As they walked, the forest opened up around them, revealing a small clearing where the trees parted to reveal an ancient structure. A stone archway, similar to the one she had passed through earlier, but larger, grander, and far older. Vines climbed up its stone columns, flowers that glowed with an inner light nestled among its cracks. The air around the archway shimmered, just as it had in the forest, and Carol felt the pull again. One of the figures, the tallest of them all, stepped forward and reached out with an elegant hand, as if offering something. The light around them pulsed, and Carol realized that what they were offering wasn't a physical object but a choice. The figure gestured toward the archway, then back toward the path they had walked, a silent invitation that made her heart race with uncertainty. She took a tentative step forward, her hand brushing against the stone of the archway. The moment her fingers touched it, a rush of images flooded her mind. Memories, or perhaps dreams, flashes of lives lived, of roads traveled, of connections made and broken. In one vision, she saw herself as a child, standing in the snow with a smile on her face as snowflakes drifted around her. In another, she saw the same smile, but it was tinged with sadness, as though the happiness she once knew had slipped through her fingers like sand. The figure moved again, drawing Carol's attention away from the visions. Its gesture was clear: step through. With a deep breath, Carol made her choice. She stepped forward, passing through the archway, leaving behind the familiar forest, the figures, and the strange, haunting whispers. As she moved through the threshold, the world seemed to shift, and for a moment, everything blurred. When her vision cleared, she found herself in a new place, one that she could not begin to understand. The surroundings were dark, the trees now twisted and barren, their limbs reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The ground beneath her feet was cracked, as if the earth itself had split open. And yet, the air was warm here, too warm, filled with a sense of urgency that made her pulse quicken. She knew that this was no mistake. She was meant to be here. The echoes of the past still lingered, but now there was a purpose to them, a mission she could not yet comprehend. The world around her seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her next move. And though she couldn't yet see the full picture, Carol knew that her journey had only just begun. The path ahead was uncertain, but she was ready to face whatever came next. Chapter 10. A Letter to the Midnight Moon. Carol stood still, her heart thundering in her chest, as the new world around her took shape. The air was different here, heavier, laden with an eerie, almost tangible sense of anticipation. The path beneath her feet had transformed, no longer soft and welcoming, but cold, hard, and jagged, as if the very earth resented her presence. Yet, the warmth from before clung to her like a second skin, comforting but unnerving, pulling her forward with a force she couldn't explain. The trees, now gaunt and twisted, loomed over her, their branches reaching out like arms, begging to be noticed, as though they too were waiting for something to happen. Their bark was blackened and scarred, some sections seemingly charred, as if they had witnessed a fire long ago and had never recovered. The stillness was profound, the kind of silence that seemed to hold the breath of a world holding onto a secret, a moment stretched too long. Carol looked around, hoping for a sign, a clue as to where she was, but everything seemed alien, despite the odd sense of familiarity that tickled the back of her mind. This place, it felt like a dream, one she had slipped into without realizing. But there was nothing whimsical about it. It was dark, unsettling. The very air seemed to pulse with a low hum that resonated deep in her bones. She could hear nothing, yet felt something stirring in the silence. A song, faint, like a forgotten lullaby on the edge of hearing. She took a step forward, her feet hesitant, unsure whether she was moving in the right direction. The trees parted as she walked, revealing an expanse of land, though it was not like the untouched beauty of the world she had just left. No, this place was older, tired, worn, like the pages of a book that had been turned too many times. The ground was cracked, the grass a dull gray, curling at the edges, as if the life it once held had drained away long ago. And then she saw it. At the center of the clearing stood a grand structure, tall, imposing, and beautifully decayed. The building was made of stone, its walls high and covered in ivy, some sections broken away, leaving behind gaping holes like wounds. It was unmistakably ancient, but there was something strangely majestic about it, a beauty that had survived the ravages of time. It reminded Carol of the cottage in the woods, the one that had once been her sanctuary, but now it felt far more distant, like a memory she couldn't quite place. Carol moved closer, the ground crunching beneath her feet, her steps louder than she would have liked. The closer she got to the building, the more she felt the song, the one she had heard before, the one that now seemed clearer, more distinct. It came from within the structure, as though it was woven into the very walls, the very air that surrounded it. It was a haunting melody, a lullaby for the lost and the forgotten, filled with a sadness that wrapped around her heart, tugging at something deep inside her. She reached the threshold, standing before an archway that seemed to breathe with the pulse of the song. The stones above her were carved with intricate patterns, symbols she didn't understand, but somehow felt she should. It was as if they were calling her, beckoning her into the unknown, urging her to step forward, to discover what lay hidden inside. Carol hesitated for only a moment. She had already come so far, crossed thresholds she hadn't known existed, and the pull of whatever awaited inside was too strong to resist. With a deep breath, she crossed the threshold, stepping into the dark interior. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating, as if it had been sealed away for centuries. The melody grew louder, clearer, each note piercing her thoughts, pulling her deeper into the heart of the building. The room stretched before her, vast and cavernous, with walls that seemed to close in as she moved. The stones beneath her feet were cold, the temperature dropping with every step she took. Yet, despite the chill, there was a strange warmth to the air, a flickering light in the distance that seemed to dance like the flame of a dying candle. As she moved toward the light, her eyes adjusted, revealing the source. At the far end of the room stood an altar, ancient and worn, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. The walls around it were lined with faded murals, each one depicting scenes of long-forgotten people, their faces obscured by time and decay. But as Carol moved closer to the altar, something caught her eye. There, at the center, was an object, faintly glowing, as if it had been waiting for her to find it. It was a book, its cover worn and cracked, the edges frayed from the passage of time. Yet, it was the glow that captured her attention, a soft, pulsing light that seemed to emanate from the very pages. Carol felt a strange compulsion to touch it, to open it, to understand what it held. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cover. The moment her skin made contact, the world around her seemed to shift. The song, which had been a faint whisper, erupted into a symphony, loud, powerful, and unyielding. The ground beneath her feet trembled as though the very foundation of the building was waking, responding to the presence of the book. The walls seemed to pulse with life, and the murals on the walls began to shift, the figures moving as though they were coming to life. Carol stepped back, startled, but something drew her in, a force greater than her fear. She opened the book, her hands shaking as the pages fluttered, revealing words and images that seemed both familiar and alien. The symbols on the pages twisted before her eyes, rearranging themselves as though they were alive, speaking to her in a language she could almost understand. And then, in the center of the book, one word appeared, glowing brighter than the rest. Remember. Carol's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what it meant, but she felt a deep, aching need to understand. The song, the structure, the book. It was all tied together, and it was all leading her somewhere. She didn't know what awaited her, but she knew one thing. The answers she sought were within her reach, and nothing, not even the fear clawing at her chest, would stop her from finding them. Chapter 11. The Crescendo of Falling Snow. The air was thick with the remnants of the forgotten song, still pulsing through the walls of the ancient structure. Carol held the book in her hands, the weight of its significance anchoring her to the present moment. But the moment itself felt fractured. The world around her flickered, shifting between the light of the book and the darkness that lay just beyond. The words she had read, the single word that had glowed so fiercely, echoed in her mind, urging her to remember. But remember what? The cold stone beneath her feet seemed to sink deeper into her consciousness as she hesitated. Was she being led deeper into something she couldn't escape? Something was stirring inside her, a whispering voice just beyond her comprehension. The book had begun to pulse again, the light from its pages bathing the chamber in an eerie, almost sacred glow. The walls now seemed less distant, pressing in on her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. A sudden draft swept through the room, ruffling her hair and sending a shiver down her spine. The flickering light from the book grew brighter, casting shadows that danced along the walls like phantoms. Carol could feel the tug of the unknown, a magnetic force drawing her closer to the altar. But her legs trembled beneath her, reluctant to move. She looked around, her gaze drawn to the murals lining the walls. They had shifted, subtly at first, but now the figures in the images were clearer, more defined. Faces of people, once obscured by the ravages of time, stared back at her with eyes that seemed both timeless and distant. The images no longer felt like mere depictions of long-forgotten beings. They were alive, watching her, and in their gazes, there was something familiar, something she couldn't place but felt deeply. A soft breath escaped her lips as she turned her attention back to the book, her fingers still lingering on the glowing page. The music had died down, replaced by a quiet hum that vibrated through the air. The sound was coming from deep within the structure, further into the bowels of the building, as if the song had found its true home. Carol had heard of such songs before, faintly remembered in old folktales, songs that could summon the past, bring forth memories buried too deep for the mind to reach. But they could also awaken something darker, something better left forgotten. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her body heavy with hesitation. The book felt warm now, as though it was calling to her with every step she took toward the altar. She had no choice but to follow. The song, the murals, the light. All of it beckoned her, pulling her into the heart of this place, this forgotten temple. As she walked, she noticed the air seemed to grow colder, the atmosphere thickening with every passing second. The walls now hummed with energy, as though they were vibrating with life, or perhaps with the echoes of a life long past. The light from the book flickered again, casting long shadows across the room that seemed to stretch toward her, whispering her name with each passing second. She had never known fear quite like this before, not even when the world had seemed its darkest. Carol reached the altar and knelt down, setting the book gently on the stone surface. The pulsing glow of the pages illuminated the room, bathing everything in its soft, ethereal light. The quiet hum grew louder now, resonating within her bones, almost as though the song had begun to play from within her, too. The altar before her had carvings, deep grooves in the stone that resembled letters, symbols from an ancient language she couldn't decipher. But as her fingers brushed over them, she felt an unexplainable warmth radiate from the grooves, as if they were alive, pulsating with a power that could not be ignored. The book opened once more on its own, the pages fluttering with a gentle rustle. She could feel the weight of the moment, the sensation that something was about to happen, something beyond her control. She could no longer deny it. The book had led her here for a reason. There, on the next page, another word appeared in bold, glowing letters, this time different from the last. It was a name she had never seen before, a name that stirred something deep inside her, something forgotten, a memory long lost in the fog of time. It was a name that should have meant nothing to her, yet it felt like a spark to her soul. Leora. The word pulsed on the page, and as it did, Carol's eyes widened. A vision began to take shape before her, a vision of a woman with eyes like her own, filled with an intensity and a sorrow that seemed impossible. The woman's face was gentle, yet strong, her expression filled with a sense of knowing, as though she had seen the future unfold and had lived through it all. Leora. The name echoed in Carol's mind, and suddenly, the room was no longer just a room. It was a place of memories, memories not her own. The walls around her shimmered, as though they were alive, opening into new paths, new doors. And before her, a figure materialized, walking toward her through the mist of time. Her heart raced as the figure came closer. It was a woman, dressed in robes of silver and pale blue, her hair long and flowing behind her like the gentle caress of a snowstorm. The woman's eyes, however, were what stopped Carol's breath. They were filled with such deep sadness, such longing, that Carol felt the weight of an entire lifetime in a single glance. Leora was here. The figure stopped just in front of Carol, her presence radiating a sense of timelessness. The air around her shimmered with light, yet the sadness never left her face. And as she stood there, her gaze fixed firmly on Carol, she spoke in silence. Not with words, but with a feeling, an emotion that Carol could not put into words but understood perfectly. It was a plea to remember, to understand, to see what had been lost. Carol swallowed, her throat dry, the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. She didn't know what Leora was asking of her, or what she had forgotten, but she knew that somehow, this was the key. The missing piece of a puzzle she hadn't even known she had started to assemble. The light around Leora intensified, blinding Carol, and she shut her eyes against it. In that moment, the air seemed to shift, to crack open, and she felt as if she was being pulled deeper into the heart of this place, into something she wasn't ready for, but could no longer avoid. When she opened her eyes again, Leora was gone, and the book lay before her, still pulsing with a soft, quiet light. Carol's heart pounded in her chest, and she reached out to close the book. But the world had changed again, and now there was no turning back. Chapter 12. When Stars Align with Ice. The world around Carol seemed to ripple with the force of the unseen, as if the very fabric of reality was shifting under her feet. She stood in the heart of the temple, its cold stone walls pressing inward like 1,000 eyes staring at her. Her heart still pounded in her chest, a frantic beat that was both her own and something else entirely, as if something had woken inside her, something that had lain dormant for longer than she could ever fathom. She stood alone now, with only the hum of the book's glow breaking the silence. There was no trace of the figure who had appeared before her, Leora, whose presence had filled the space with an ethereal weight that seemed to hang in the air, pressing down on her soul. The figure was gone, vanished like a whisper carried away by the wind, but the memory of her, of the longing in her eyes, stayed with Carol like a shadow that refused to fade. The light from the book softened, pulsing rhythmically like the heartbeat of the temple itself. Carol hesitated, her fingers still trembling as they lingered over the pages. The weight of the silence around her seemed almost unnatural, a void that pressed in on her, urging her to act, to understand, to remember. But what was she supposed to remember? What was she being led to? The questions burned in her mind, relentless and sharp, but the answers remained just beyond her grasp, like smoke slipping through her fingers. With a slow breath, Carol closed the book gently, but the light did not fade. Instead, the pages seemed to shimmer, alive with energy, as though the book itself was trying to communicate something important. It was more than a simple object. It felt like a living thing, a being with a purpose that reached out to her from the depths of the unknown. She turned away from the altar and walked toward the far side of the room, where a narrow staircase spiraled upward, hidden in the shadows. The cold stone steps felt firm beneath her feet as she ascended, the hum of the temple growing louder with each step. Her mind raced as she climbed, her thoughts circling back to Leora. Who was she, and why had she appeared before Carol? It was then, as she reached the top of the staircase, that she noticed the change. The walls here were different, carved with symbols she could not recognize, but which seemed to pulse with the same light that emanated from the book. The air felt different, too, thick with something ancient, something that had not stirred in centuries, maybe longer. Carol stepped forward, her hand trailing along the wall, feeling the faint warmth of the carvings beneath her fingertips. As she walked deeper into the chamber, the light from the book now seeming to fill the space, the hum in the air grew almost tangible, vibrating through her bones. The room stretched out before her like a vast, open expanse, its size deceiving in the way that old, forgotten places often are. There was no clear source of the light, no candles or torches, only the soft glow from the book, and it was as if the light itself had become a part of the room, breathing with it. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, simple in design but adorned with intricate carvings that mirrored those on the walls. A single object rested atop the pedestal, another book, its cover dark and worn with age. The sense of familiarity that washed over Carol was immediate, as though she had been here before, in a dream or a memory, though she could not place the origin of such a thought. The book on the pedestal felt like the missing piece of the puzzle, the thing she had been searching for without realizing it. She approached it slowly, reverently, the air around it thick with a presence that seemed to hum in harmony with her every step. When her fingers brushed the cover of the book, she felt a jolt of energy shoot up her arm, sending a shiver down her spine. The sensation was more than physical. It was a wave of recognition, a flash of understanding that surged through her, erasing the doubts that had clung to her since she had first entered the temple. This was the key. This was what she had been searching for. She opened the book, the pages thick and heavy with age, their edges worn and frayed. As she flipped through them, her eyes caught on a single phrase, written in the same glowing script that had appeared in the previous book. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the words aloud, though her voice barely registered in the silence. To find the path, you must first lose yourself. The words felt like a riddle, their meaning elusive yet familiar. She turned the page, but there was nothing more, just an empty expanse of white paper, as though the rest of the book had been lost to time. But the words lingered, swirling in her mind like smoke, elusive yet insistent. What did it mean to lose oneself? And how did it lead her to the path she was meant to follow? As she closed the book, a distant sound reached her ears, faint at first but growing louder, like the whisper of the wind before a storm. It was a song, a haunting melody that seemed to emanate from the very walls around her. The tune was unfamiliar, yet it struck a chord deep within her, stirring something long buried, something she had forgotten but now remembered. It was a call, a beckoning, urging her to move forward, to continue her journey. The sound was growing louder now, the melody wrapping itself around her, filling her senses with its beauty and its sorrow. It was a song of loss and longing, a song that spoke of love lost and love found, of memories forgotten and memories remembered. The song seemed to rise and fall with the rhythm of her heartbeat, pulling her deeper into the chamber, pulling her toward the source of the music. Without thinking, Carol took a step forward, then another, her feet moving almost on their own as she followed the song, its pull irresistible. The walls around her seemed to bend and twist as she moved, the light from the book now fading into the distance. But the song, its melody remained, filling the space, guiding her as she walked into the unknown. And with each step, Carol felt herself unraveling, losing the certainty of her past and stepping into something new, something beyond her understanding. The further she walked, the more the air seemed to shift, as though she were walking into a dream that was both familiar and strange, a dream she had been part of long before she had arrived here. Chapter 13. The Frost's Forgotten Serenade. Carol's footsteps echoed in the vast, dimly lit corridor as she followed the haunting melody. Her body moved automatically, as though guided by an unseen force, each step carrying her deeper into the heart of the temple. The walls, once solid and ancient, now seemed to shift and breathe, alive with the rhythm of the song. The faint glow of the book she had closed moments before flickered in her memory, a reminder of her journey, but it was no longer the source of her attention. The song, the only sound in this ethereal place, consumed her, threading through the air, its tendrils curling around her like a soft mist. The air had grown colder with each passing moment, and Carol pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, though the chill did not seem to come from the wind. It was as though the very air itself had turned to ice, the temperature falling in tandem with the increasing intensity of the melody. The sound had transformed, becoming more distinct now, clearer, fuller, a mournful cry that seemed to echo the weight of the world's sorrow. It pulled at Carol's chest, a tug of something ancient and forgotten, something she couldn't name. As she rounded a corner in the hall, a strange sight appeared before her. The floor beneath her feet was dusted with snow, pristine and untouched, as if the temple itself had been transformed into a winter wonderland. The snow lay in thick layers, its icy surface sparkling faintly in the dim light. It was not the kind of snow Carol had ever seen. There was no wind, no cold bite to the air. Only the quiet beauty of snow that had no beginning and no end, suspended in time. She stepped forward, her boots crunching on the snow with every movement, and immediately the sound of her footsteps seemed to fade, swallowed by the overwhelming silence that had settled around her. The song continued to play, now louder than before, but no longer in the distant background. It filled the space completely, reverberating off the walls and curling around Carol like a dream she could not wake from. The song, though haunting, felt strangely comforting, as if it spoke directly to something within her, something that had been waiting for this moment. The snow beneath her feet grew deeper, and soon, she found herself walking through drifts that rose higher than her waist. Each step took more effort, and yet she could not stop, could not turn back. The air, now thick with the song's melancholy beauty, seemed to push her forward, guiding her towards something that awaited her in the heart of this wintry world. Through the swirling snow, she could make out a shape in the distance, a figure, standing still in the center of the snowfield. At first, it seemed like a shadow, a mirage against the white backdrop, but as Carol drew closer, the figure came into sharper focus. It was a person, draped in robes of white, their face hidden beneath the hood. The figure stood motionless, facing the direction Carol had come from, as if waiting, as if expecting her arrival. A sudden shiver ran through Carol as she approached, her heartbeat quickening. She knew, deep down, that she had seen this figure before. The robes, the haunting presence. It was the same person who had guided her through the temple, the one who had led her here, to this moment. The presence was undeniable. Leora. The song seemed to swell with emotion as Carol reached the figure, its notes thick with longing and sorrow. The robe-clad figure did not move, but the presence was tangible, overwhelming, as if the snow itself were breathing, alive with anticipation. Carol stopped just a few steps away, unable to take the next one, as though the space between them was a boundary she could not cross. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time in what felt like ages, she hesitated. Leora remained silent, her figure as still and immovable as the snow around them. There was something solemn in the air, something unspoken but heavy with meaning. Carol's mind raced with questions, but all she could do was stare at the figure before her, unable to tear her eyes away. Why had Leora led her here? What was it she had to understand? The questions lingered, unanswered, as she stood on the threshold of a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Without warning, the figure moved, a fluid motion that seemed to disturb the very air around it. Leora raised her arms, and the snow around them began to shift, swirling up in the air. a gentle storm of sparkling white that danced around Carol like a sea of shimmering stars. The wind picked up, but it was not cold. It was the warmth of something ancient, something older than time itself. The snow danced around them in a spiral, the rhythm of the song becoming even more pronounced. The figure's voice, though silent, spoke to Carol, an understanding without words. It was in the movement, in the rhythm of the snow, in the pulse of the song that seemed to carry all the answers she had been searching for. She felt a sense of knowing deep in her soul, a recognition of something she had forgotten. The song was a call. The song was a message, and she had been meant to follow it, meant to step into this place, to face the truth that had been waiting for her all along. Carol's body trembled, but it was not from fear. It was the deep, stirring realization that this moment was not an accident. She had been chosen, had been brought here for a reason she was only beginning to understand. The path she had walked had not been a simple journey. It had been a preparation, a series of steps that led her to this moment in the snow, where she would finally see what lay beyond the veil. The swirling snow around her began to slow, the dance of light and shadow calming into a stillness that hung in the air. The song's final notes rang out, soft and clear, like the last echo of a forgotten dream. The snow settled, the figure's robes falling still once more. In the silence that followed, Carol knew she had reached the end of one path and the beginning of another. The journey was not over. It had only just begun. Carol took a deep breath and stepped forward, the snow beneath her feet the only sound as she moved toward the waiting figure. Chapter 14. A Lullaby for the Winter's End. The stillness of the temple had become almost suffocating as Carol stepped closer to Leora, the ethereal figure standing motionless in the center of the snow-covered expanse. The song, once distant and haunting, was now a tangible presence in the air, wrapping around her like an invisible cloak. The quiet hum seemed to pulse within her chest, syncing with the rhythm of her heartbeat. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure of what to do. But there was no turning back now. The figure, though silent, was calling her, guiding her in ways that defied logic. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, as though the snow itself was an anchor, urging her to stay rooted to this place. But despite the weight in her feet, a burning desire stirred deep inside her. A longing, a need to know what lay ahead, what truth awaited beyond the veil of this strange, frozen world. As she approached, the air seemed to shift. The heavy silence began to dissipate, replaced by a faint crackling sound, like the softest whisper of fire in the distance. At first, Carol thought it was just the wind, but there was something unmistakable in the warmth that followed, a sensation that spread through her, igniting the chill that had settled in her bones. The snow beneath her feet had grown thicker as she walked deeper into the temple, but now it seemed to melt slightly, a small trail of liquid following her path. The ice was giving way to something else, something more fluid, more alive. The further she went, the warmer the air became, as though the temple itself was responding to her presence. There was something sacred about this place, a balance between cold and warmth that neither overwhelmed the other, but instead created a harmony that hummed through the very foundation of the space. Leora remained still, her face obscured by the hood of her cloak, but Carol felt a sense of familiarity in her presence. There was no need for words now. The silence between them was filled with everything unsaid. The temple had brought her here, had guided her steps through this journey, and now, it seemed, it was offering her a final test. The song, ever present, began to rise in intensity again, its notes sharpening, becoming more defined, more urgent. The sound swirled around Carol like a beacon, pulling her closer, urging her toward the center of the temple. She knew then that the song was not merely music. It was a key to unlocking something greater, something beyond her understanding. Suddenly, the warmth in the air intensified, a sharp, sudden heat that radiated from the center of the room. It was not the fire she had imagined, not the dancing flames of warmth she had hoped for, but something more elusive, more elemental. A light began to appear before her, glowing faintly at first, like the first flicker of a flame in the dark. It grew stronger with each passing second, its warmth enveloping her like the embrace of a long-lost memory. Carol stepped forward without thinking. The light beckoned her, drawing her into its warmth, and in that moment, she understood. This light, this fire, was not just a force of nature. It was a symbol, a presence that carried the soul of the temple, of the journey she had taken, and of the path that lay ahead. The temple had been guiding her toward this very moment, toward this single, fleeting spark that would illuminate everything she had come to find. With her heart pounding, Carol stepped into the light. The warmth washed over her like a wave, filling her with a sense of peace, of purpose that she had never known before. She closed her eyes as the light enveloped her, her breath steadying in the calm that followed. For a brief moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped, and in that stillness, she heard a voice, a soft, delicate whisper that echoed in her mind, though there were no words to grasp. The warmth seemed to expand, pushing out the cold that had filled her body, and in the silence, Carol felt a deep connection to the space around her. It was not just the temple or the song. It was everything. The earth, the snow, the stars, the fire. It was all one. She was one with it, and it was one with her. The veil between the physical and the spiritual had faded, and she could see now what had been hidden for so long. In that moment, she understood the nature of the fire. It was not simply a force that burned. It was a force that created, that guided, that illuminated the way forward. It was the flame of understanding, the light of truth that had guided her on this journey. And now, it was ready to lead her to the final step of her journey. Carol opened her eyes, her heart racing with anticipation. She could feel the presence of Leora beside her, though she had not moved. The song had softened, its final notes ringing in the air like the echo of a faraway bell. But the warmth remained, a constant presence at the center of this sacred space. Carol stood still for a moment longer, soaking in the feeling of completeness, of connection. The fire had revealed its truth to her, and now it was time for her to take the final step. She turned to face Leora, her heart steady in her chest. The figure stood as still as ever, yet there was a presence in the air, a silent understanding that passed between them. It was time. The light around them began to shift, its form blurring as it swirled around Carol, becoming a part of her, surrounding her like a protective aura. She felt its warmth pulse within her chest, felt the flame that had once been distant now ignite within her own heart. It was the same light, the same fire, that had guided her this far, and now it was a part of her. With a final glance at Leora, Carol knew that the end of one journey had led to the beginning of another. The flame, now a part of her very being, would guide her through whatever came next. She was no longer a mere traveler through this temple. She had become the light, the flame that burned brightly in the dark, ready to illuminate the way forward. And as the song faded into silence, she stepped forward, ready to embrace the unknown. The journey had only just begun. Chapter 15. Love in the Final Chorus. The wind had quieted, leaving behind an eerie stillness that seemed to hum with anticipation. Carol stood at the edge of the temple, her heart still thrumming with the rhythm of the light that had enveloped her moments before. The world around her had changed. Where once there had been snow, now there was something more. A blanket of frost that seemed to shimmer beneath the pale moonlight. The air was crisp, each breath she took sharp but invigorating, as if the very atmosphere had been renewed by the fire she had embraced. She looked back at the temple, its stone structure now bathed in the soft glow of the first light of dawn. It was as though the building itself had come alive, breathing with the same warmth that filled her chest. The walls, once cold and imposing, now appeared inviting, a symbol of the journey she had completed and the one that lay ahead. And yet, Carol knew that the temple, as magnificent as it was, had always been only the beginning. The true test had never been about reaching the temple or even about the lessons it held. The real journey had always been about the transformation within her. As she took her first step forward, the ground beneath her feet shifted, the snow softly crunching under her boots. But it was different now. Each step felt lighter, almost weightless, as though the earth itself was supporting her, carrying her along the path that was now laid out before her. It was a path that seemed to stretch on forever, winding through the vast expanse of the snow-covered landscape, but Carol no longer felt lost. She no longer felt alone. Behind her, she could feel the presence of Leora, though the figure remained a shadow in the distance. It was as though the figure had been a guide, a guardian, and now Carol had become the one to carry the flame. The warmth within her chest had grown brighter, more alive, and the very air around her seemed to pulse with it. She had been transformed, and in that transformation, she had found the strength to carry on. The snow beneath her feet began to fall once more, soft and delicate, as if the earth itself were celebrating the change that had taken place. The first flakes of winter, gentle and pure, settled on her hair and shoulders like a gentle kiss from the sky. She raised her face to the heavens, feeling the cool touch of the snow on her skin, and for the first time in her life, she felt at peace. It was as though the entire world had stopped for a moment, holding its breath in the quiet anticipation of something beautiful. The first snowfall of forever had arrived, and with it, a sense of renewal. There was no longer a past that haunted her, no longer a future that felt uncertain. All that mattered was the present, the here, the now, and the endless possibilities that stretched out before her. Carol continued walking, her steps slow but sure. The snow beneath her seemed to guide her, leading her down the path that was her own to walk. The fire within her had not diminished. It burned brighter than ever, illuminating the way ahead. And as she walked, she realized that this was what she had been searching for all along. Not the destination, not the temple, but the journey itself. The journey was where the magic happened. It was in each step, each breath, each snowflake that touched her skin. She didn't know where this path would lead her, but she no longer needed to. She had found something more important than answers. She had found peace in the unknown. The mysteries of the world, once overwhelming and terrifying, no longer held the same weight. She was no longer afraid of the journey, for she had learned that it was not the destination that mattered, but the experience itself. As the snow continued to fall, the landscape around her transformed. The once barren trees now sparkled with the soft glow of the snow, their branches heavy with the weight of the season. The world was waking up, embracing the change, and Carol was right there with it. The transformation she had undergone had mirrored the transformation of the world around her. She had become part of something much larger, much more beautiful than she had ever imagined. The song, that haunting melody that had once filled the air, now seemed distant, almost forgotten. Yet, in its absence, Carol felt the resonance of its presence in her heart. The song had been a guide, a whisper of truth, but now she no longer needed its call. She was the song now. The fire, the light, the snow. They were all part of her, and she was part of them. She had found her place in the world, not as a wanderer, but as someone who had finally come home. As she walked, her steps carrying her deeper into the snowy landscape, she realized that the temple, the journey, the fire, and the song had all led her to this moment, the moment when she was free. Free to love, free to live, free to embrace the endless possibilities that awaited her. She was no longer held by the past, no longer confined by the boundaries of her former self. She was a new being, one with the world and with the fire that had kindled her soul. The snow continued to fall around her, each flake a delicate touch of nature, a reminder of the beauty that could be found in the simplest things. And as she looked ahead, Carol saw the first light of the day creeping over the horizon, casting a soft golden glow over the snow-covered world. The sun, the light, the warmth, they were all there, waiting for her. She smiled to herself, a soft, contented smile. The journey had been long, but it had been worth it. For now, she was ready to embrace whatever came next, ready to live the life she had always dreamed of, ready to love without fear. The first snowfall of forever had arrived, and with it, Carol knew that her story was only just beginning. And as the snow fell gently around her, Carol walked on, her heart filled with the warmth of the fire, the peace of the snow, and the love that would carry her through whatever the future held. The journey, it seemed, had no end, and neither did the love that burned inside her. It was only the beginning of forever. Chapter 16. The snow melts, but the song remains. The silence of the world was thick, comforting, and alive with a strange kind of promise. The snow had fallen heavily during the night, blanketing the earth in a pristine layer of white. It was as if the world had been wrapped in a soft, delicate quilt, untouched and still. The first light of dawn was barely beginning to touch the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and rose, a quiet prelude to the new day. Carol stood at the edge of the meadow, her breath visible in the cold, crisp air. She felt the weight of the world beneath her feet, the snow giving way to the softest of crunches as she shifted her weight. The trees, their branches heavy with frost, stood like silent sentinels around her, watching over the land. She felt their presence, comforting yet distant, as though they were all waiting for something, a signal, a sign, a moment. And she, too, was waiting, but not for a moment to come. She was waiting for the moment to arrive, fully alive, in the here and now. The path ahead of her seemed to stretch on forever, disappearing into the fog that hung low over the snow-covered ground. Yet there was no fear in her heart now. The fog was not a veil that concealed the future. It was an invitation to embrace what lay beyond the horizon, a reminder that there was always more to discover, more to experience. The uncertainty that once clung to her like a shadow now felt like a part of her, a quiet companion that allowed her to see the beauty of the unknown. She had learned, over the course of her journey, that the beauty of the world was not in the answers it offered, but in the questions it posed. There was something raw and beautiful about the way the world shifted, about how every moment, every step, had led her here. It was all part of the story, part of the endless unfolding that had begun the day she had first stepped into the snow. The first snowflake had been the spark that ignited her journey, and now, she had become part of the ever-falling snow, a piece of something larger than herself. Carol closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the snowflakes as they began to fall once more. Each one was a delicate, intricate creation, each one unique, yet all part of the same pattern. She imagined herself as one of those snowflakes, drifting through the world, caught in the winds of fate and choice, finding her place among the others, only to dissolve into something new once her time had passed. And yet, she was not afraid. There was no fear in the thought of impermanence, only a quiet acceptance that this was the way things were meant to be. The world was in constant motion, and she was a part of that movement. She was both the snowflake and the wind that carried it. Her thoughts shifted to Leora, the figure who had guided her, who had stood by her through the moments of doubt and despair. It was impossible to see her now, but Carol felt her presence all the same, like a warmth in her chest that she could never forget. Leora had taught her something precious. The power of belief, of embracing what could not be seen, of trusting in what the heart knew to be true. It was a lesson that Carol carried with her, one that had blossomed into something far more than she had ever imagined. Leora was no longer a distant figure. She was a part of her, woven into the very fabric of her being. Carol had learned to trust not just the light around her, but the light within her. The wind stirred the trees, sending a flurry of snowflakes drifting through the air, and for a moment, Carol thought she saw a shadow move among the branches. She blinked, but when her eyes opened again, the figure was gone. Perhaps it was nothing more than a trick of the light or the wind playing with her senses. But she smiled to herself, knowing that it didn't matter. She felt the presence of those who had come before her. Their voices, their whispers, their love, still lingering in the air, still shaping the world around her. It was the kind of love that transcended time, that continued to exist even when the bodies that once carried it were no longer there. Carol turned away from the trees and began to walk forward, her steps slow but steady. She didn't know where she was headed, and for the first time, she didn't need to. There was no map, no guide, no clear path laid out before her. There was only the snow beneath her feet, the sky above her head, and the warmth of the light within her. She knew that the journey would never truly end. It would shift, change, and unfold in ways she could not predict, but that was part of the beauty of it. The unknown had become her companion, and she had learned to walk beside it with grace, her heart full of hope. The snow began to fall heavier now, each flake a delicate message from the heavens, each one a reminder that the world was alive, constantly evolving, constantly changing. The wind picked up, tugging at her hair, urging her forward, pushing her towards something yet to be revealed. She didn't resist. She couldn't. It felt as though the world itself was calling to her, urging her to step into the next chapter of her life, to embrace the love that had already begun to bloom in her heart. And so she walked, one step, then another. Each step took her farther from the past and closer to the future, but it didn't matter. She wasn't focused on what lay ahead. She wasn't worried about the destination. She was simply walking, simply being, with the full understanding that this moment, this very breath, was all she had. And it was enough. Carol felt the pull of the world, the gentle tug of fate, guiding her forward. She didn't know where it would lead her, but for the first time in her life, she was no longer afraid of the unknown. She was no longer afraid of the journey. She was ready, ready to embrace whatever came next, ready to love, to live, to feel the warmth of the sun on her face and the snow beneath her feet. With each step, she knew she was walking towards something beautiful, something real, something she had never dared to imagine until now. The world stretched out before her, wide and open, filled with possibility. And as the snow continued to fall around her, Carol smiled, knowing that whatever the future held, she was ready to face it. The first snowflakes of forever had come, and with them, the beginning of a new story. A story that would unfold with each new dawn, each new step, and each new embrace of the love that had always been hers. The world was waiting, and she was finally home,